Hi, everybody. I'm Nate Wiggum. I'm with Ian Capital. We do commercial real estate capital advisory, debt and equity placement across all property types all over the country. And I'm here with Adam Greenfader.
Thanks, Nate. Adam Greenfader here, managing partner of AG&T. We are real estate developers and advisors. We focus on residential and hotel properties in the Caribbean, Latin America, and Puerto Rico.
So today, we're going to talk about Puerto Rico, but specifically in the context of bringing back critical manufacturing to the U.S. and how Puerto Rico traditionally has fit into that equation and what the opportunity around that really is today. All right, so let's kind of go into just a brief history of the island in general. So the U.S. acquired Puerto Rico in 1898 when it defeated Spain in the Spanish-American War. And then probably the next most notable event in the history was in 1920, the passing of the Jones Act. Do you mind speaking to that a little bit, what exactly that is and what that means?
Yes, absolutely. So in order to understand Puerto Rico, you really do need to understand that Puerto Rico, first of all, was ruled for hundreds of years by the Spanish and Spanish military. So it was a island that was conquered from a military perspective and run and managed as a military fortress. And then the U.S. came in and basically continued, the military rule of the island of Puerto Rico. You had mentioned the beauty of the Old San Juan. Old San Juan was essentially a Spanish fort system that was built with even underground caves to move ammunitions and whatnot. It's fascinating. But when the U.S. acquired Puerto Rico in the Spanish-American War, immediately Puerto Ricans were conscripted into the First World War. Here comes the U.S., takes over Puerto Rico, and now Puerto Ricans are fighting in the First World War. There's a picture here on the slide of the Second World War. So Puerto Ricans have fought in almost every American war, since World War I. And the United States wanted to have a control and wants to have a control of Puerto Rico. And the Jones Act specifically is an act that requires all shipping that comes in and out of Puerto Rico to be on U.S. ships. So while Puerto Rico might be physically detached from the United States by a body of water, for all intents and purposes, everything that happens in Puerto Rico has to be on U.S. ships. Now, there's been people that have, mentioned that might increase the cost of goods that arise on the island, and it can be a negative thing, while there's other groups that believe that, by maintaining the U.S. umbrella in Puerto Rico, it maintains the island strong. I don't really have an opinion on that, but we do know that just recently there was, for the next 2 years, all airlift that comes into Puerto Rico can come in from both national and foreign countries. So Puerto Rico has had a small exception to this Jones Act from anything that has to do with airlift. Now, this could be really a game changer because Puerto Rico has always been kind of this connection to South America and to Europe, just by its geographic location. So I think that we might be seeing a deterioration of this Jones Act, some kind of flexibility to allow the island a little bit more control, at least right now in terms of air cargo. From a historical perspective, Puerto Rico, and this we're going to talk a little bit more about, didn't always control its own government. The U.S. for a long time had its own governors that it would elect in order to control the economy and the political system. And it wasn't until the 50s that Luis Muñoz Marin was elected the first governor of Puerto Rico. And that really led to some very exciting things and growth for the island.
Right. So let's continue to talk about the 1950s, because that's, it's really important to understand kind of what was going on in Cuba at the time, what was going on here, kind of how that influenced the administration at the time to actually make some decisive choices about the direction of the Puerto Rican economy, which, kind of lead into everything we're talking about today.
Yeah, absolutely. This was a monumental period. It was called Operation Bootstrap. And like the Marshall Plan after World War II, the 1950s and early 60s really saw a lot of turbulence in the Caribbean region, in particular with this Cold War between the U.S. And the Russians. And when Cuba and Fidel Castro eventually took over, there was this gaping hole of industries and businesses that needed to move somewhere else. I mean, all these casinos and hotels that were active in Cuba for decades. And my mom even, she was a famous model back then, and I have pictures of her in Cuba in the 1950s and early 60s. It was a really fun place to be. I mean, it was kind of like a Las Vegas, but unfortunately controlled by organized crime. And when Fidel ended up nationalizing all those hotels and casinos and other industries, organized crime in particular, asked itself, well, where are we going to go? Well, the next closest and bestest place with similar geography and climate was Puerto Rico. So they all had their eyes set on, let's build hundreds of hotel rooms in Puerto Rico. If you've read your history, the Kennedys and organized crime weren't necessarily the best of friends. There's a lot of conspiracy theories about what happened at the Bay of Pigs. But long story short, the Kennedys said no, no, no to tourism in Puerto Rico as a way of kind of cutting the amount and reducing the amount of organized crime. So it was very, for a Caribbean island to not be able to generate revenues from tourism is a strange thing, right? I mean, most of the islands in the Caribbean have 60 to 70 to 90% of their total income from tourism. So the Kennedys got together, and John F. Kennedy in particular, a great visionary with Luis Munoz Marin, and you can see in this photograph, they created this plan called Operation Bootstrap, as well as Operation Serenity, which most people don't know of. But essentially what that did was create manufacturing as the principal industry for Puerto Rico. And a precursor to what was the 936 was established at the time, essentially creating some very, very lucrative tax incentives for manufacturing. And so Puerto Rico, this island with beautiful beaches and amazing rainforests and great historic artifacts, essentially became one big manufacturing plant. And it boomed. The economy was amazing, a lot of growth. I think that one time from the 1960s, Puerto Rico's economy was upwards of 7 to 9% GDP. I mean, unheard of numbers. Really, an amazing amount of growth happened between that period of time. And the island became the top farmer producer of the world. Puerto Rico, almost any legal drug you've ever consumed was most likely made in Puerto Rico at one time or another. So it was an economic plan that worked. It created, a boom in so many other industries. Real estate in particular was, on fire for 30, 40 years. When I lived there, it was very typical for most people to own 1, 2, 3 homes. Your second home, your third home, and I'm talking across all income classes. It was just a great time to be in Puerto Rico, and it shows what we can all do when we come together and set a plan.
Wow. Yeah. So when you were here developing homes here, and what decade was that?
So I arrived in Puerto Rico in 1993, and we were building about 200 homes a year from 1993 all the way to about 2003.
And during that time, the economy was it sounds like it was just on fire.
It was. I mean, if you looked at the landscape of Puerto Rico, and still it very much looks like that today, there are 78 municipalities in Puerto Rico. There were probably 1 to 3 manufacturing plants in almost every municipality. So it was spread out equidistant throughout the island. I mean, from north, south, east, and west, there was, manufacturing plants, and these manufacturing plants were hiring and paying very high salaries. I mean, we qualified young, workers at these plants, guys and girls that were in their teens, really 19, 20, 21, and they were earning in the 90s, they were earning, between $11 and $16 an hour. Very big salaries, and that led to, the buying of homes and really the moving of the economy. I mean, banks like Citibank, they were in Puerto Rico at the time, and they would, lend us construction money, and it was called 936 funds. And basically, it was a reduced LIBOR rate that was generated from all these extra profit that was coming in from the manufacturing industry.
So we appreciate you taking the time to watch this presentation. Hope it was informative. If you're interested in learning more about the opportunities in Puerto Rico, of which there are many, feel free to reach out to either one of us. There's a link below to go to our website to download a copy of the presentation as well.